Hello, everyone. Welcome to this training that we are launching, the Family Resource Center, New FEC Family Empowerment Center, along with Karen Breslau. She's from the San Mateo County Office of Education. She's going to be facilitating and presenting this training, How to Read Your Child's IEP. Next slide. I just want to go ahead and actually mention that the Family Resource Center, we are here, the team is here tonight. I want to introduce the Family Support Services Manager, Sonia, and Gabriela Diaz-Santos, our Family Resource Coordinator, and Iris Wen, Training Coordinator. And my name is Patricia Idrujo. I'm the Family Resource Center Supervisor. We have a couple of housekeeping items for this training, and this session is being recorded. We want to be sure that this training is available for our families who can visit our webpage. And we also want to be able to use it also for internal training and for our new staff. Please select English or Spanish language channel, and you see the options that look like in the Zoom. There's a button at the bottom. You can select English if you want to listen to this training in English, or Spanish if you want to do so. Please mute yourself when not speaking. Turn off or off your camera based on your preference. Use the chat box or raise hand feature for questions and comments. We have a Q&A portion at the end of this training. Well, we encourage families and people participating today to refrain from mentioning names or sharing detailed information to protect the confidentiality of your case. We will definitely send an email tomorrow with materials and handouts and the PowerPoint presentation that the presenter is going to share with you tonight. Next slide. The Family Resource Center provides free support for families and services for families of children with special needs and disabilities from age 0 to 22. And also we serve the professionals who work with them. We offer parent-to-parent support, information and systems navigation, referral services, trainings and workshops, support groups. We have a resource binder in English and Spanish, and we have a newsletter that is sent monthly at the beginning of the month. I have information here about how to contact us. If Iris can put on the chat a phone number and an email so that you guys can follow us, that'd be great. We service in English and Spanish, but we also have the capacity to serve other languages. We have a language line and interpretation line, so we can serve all languages. Thank you. Next slide. And then without further ado, I want to introduce Karen. Karen, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I don't get to speak with parents often enough, so this is very exciting for me, and also to be involved with the Family Resource Center. Very, very strong educational partners, and we will be growing that relationship this year, which is really exciting. So again, thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. Let's go to the first slide, the next slide. So I'm hoping that you have a copy of your child's IEP on one hand, so that you can check against what it is that we're going to be talking about. And the actual forms will be sent to you in an email tomorrow, as you heard. So today, what I want to do is just have you take a glance at your child's IEP and make sure that the things that need to be here are accurately recorded on your child's IEP. As was mentioned, we are going to have time for a Q&A. I won't be able to give you much advice on your individual situation, but I can answer general questions about IEPs. And at the end, I'll make sure you have my phone number and my email address, so that if we do need to follow through and get you some more information, I'll be able to do that. So to get started, I'm starting on the first page now of your IEP, and this is called the Information Eligibility page. it's extremely important that the information that's on this page is accurate. When we are keeping our IEPs in compliance, making sure that everything is correct, there's actually 3 different systems that are involved. One is the system called the Student Information System that your district holds information about your children on. Then there is the IEP system, or SACE. This is where your IEPs are written. And then a lot of this information is also reported to the CDE, or the California Department of Education. And so we need to make sure all the information in all 3 of those systems match. And that's why when you go to an IEP meeting, they spend a lot of time making sure that addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, all of those are accurate. So at the very, very top, you're going to see that there are going to be some dates there. It's a good idea to keep copies of all of your IEPs in a binder so that they're together. One of the things you'll want to check is on these dates to make sure that they are lined up with where you think they should be. If your dates are different from the ones that appear on a new IEP, you're going to want to bring everyone's attention to it. Sometimes there are reasons for that, and sometimes that means you don't have the most up-to-date copy. So the first thing they're going to do is review dates with you, and then the data that's underneath that line there, your child's age, their English language status, and some of those other things, that is going to match something that you filled out when your child was enrolled in kindergarten, something called the home language survey. And that's the basis upon which all kinds of information is either tested or cleared on your child's IEP. So it's important that that information, if it doesn't sound right to you, is something that you let your case manager know in an IEP meeting. Let's go to the next slide. And again, this is where the information for your name and address and phone numbers, all of those things are recorded. Whatever you see on the IEP is supposed to be what's in all those 3 systems that we talked about. So if you've changed your address, if you've changed an email address or something like that, your IEP team really needs to know that. If you've moved, even within your district's boundaries, you might be asked to do address verification again. You won't have to produce your child's birth certificate and all of those other documents, but the systems need to know that you've moved. And the only way to do that is to let your case manager know, the person who's leading the IEP, oh, we've moved, and they'll take care of it from there. Next slide. Okay, so for me, this is, I think, the most important piece of the that first page, the information eligibility. And you're going to see 2 things here that are very important. Number 1 is at the top of that section, it asks to indicate your child's primary and their secondary disability. What that means is that the IEP team, including you, have decided that your child's disability, there's one that's primary and one that's secondary. If it's primary, then the reason it's been designated as primary is because that's the one that the team feels has had the bigger impact on your child's learning. This section of the IEP is all about the implications your child's disability has on their learning in the classroom. So the IEP team should have had a discussion, including you, as to which is the primary, and if there is a secondary disability, then that one would be included as well. I had a brother who was severely disabled, and his primary disability would have been ID, or an intellectual disability. His secondary would have been speech and language impairment, because he was pretty much nonverbal. The reason that the intellectual disability would be primary and the speech secondary is because when it came to his learning profile, because of his intellectual disability, that had the biggest impact on his learning. It's true, he wasn't very well able to communicate, but that was also secondary to his intellectual disability. So when you look at your child's IEP and you think, I'm not sure that this is recorded properly, please let your case manager know, because that's a very important part of what comes next, which is a description of how your child's disability affects their learning. So in this box, really what should happen is not just another statement of your child's disability. Sometimes we see that a case manager might say something like, due to this student's, let's say, speech and language impairment, they continue to have trouble in the classroom. That's not what we're looking for. What really goes in there and what you should see in there is the effect that speech and language impairment has on your child in the classroom. So when the case manager is writing that paragraph, in their head, they're saying, because of this child's speech and language disability in the classroom, and then they start writing. So it might be that this student continues to have difficulty following classroom discussions, understanding humor, and struggles with asking questions, putting together and asking questions. So it's, what do you observe in the classroom due to your child's disability? That's what goes in there. And if you don't see a clear description of that, it'll be brief. It won't be very long at all. It's a small box. But you should be starting to see that, oh, because of my child's disability, this is what their struggles are like in the classroom. Next slide. So that's the information eligibility page. And what the information eligibility page does is it pretty much identifies and describes the disability. And the present levels, this is where you are going to get a ton of data about your child and their learning. So typically, what happens when an IEP is being scheduled is that parents are sent a form or there's a telephone conversation. And either way, what the case manager is trying to do is get an idea from you who have your child 24/7, what you see as their strengths, the kinds of activities they prefer, and the kinds of things that they're interested in. They're also going to want to know what you're concerned about. So either you're going to fill in a form or you're going to have a conversation. And even though, and then about 3 days before the IEP, now I'm saying some very general rules about IEPs, and these apply to those students who are being educated in San Mateo County. If your child is attending school in Santa Clara or in San Francisco, there might be some differences, but in this county, the practice is to send home a draft of the IEP no later than 3 days before the IEP meeting. When I say draft, I don't mean the whole IEP. What I really mean is this form, which is the present levels form, and then also the proposed goals. The reason we have chosen those two forms to send home is that we, meaning the educators in San Mateo County, want to make sure you have all the data that everyone else on the IEP team has before you get to the meeting. You should not be surprised. So we're going to see in a couple more slides what that data looks like, but it begins with these two sections. On the basis of these data that are on the 2 pages of the present levels, you'll also receive a copy of the proposed goals, and we'll be talking about goals in just a few minutes. The goals that are being proposed are for you to think about, because what that shows you is the decisions that the IEP team is starting to make about your child based on the data that they've given you in present levels. So you're going to provide a lot of that data too. For instance, in the strengths, preferences, and interests, it's so important to have your data included in this overall, that even though you've talked to the case manager, even though you've filled out a form, they're going to ask you in the meeting, now that you've had a couple of days to review these forms, is there anything we forgot? Is there something that should be added? And that's to make sure that your voice is heard loudly and clearly in an IEP. You know, IDEA was passed in the early 2000s, but then when it was reauthorized, what Congress was saying to us as educators is that you need to do a better job of moving the voice of the student and the family to the forefront of the IEP. We don't think you're listening, is basically what they said. And so educators are now taking this even more seriously than they had before, because what we don't want to have is your child getting to the end of their time in the public schools where you thought they were being prepared, let's say, to go to a four-year university, but actually the courses they took will only get them into a community college. So it's super important throughout your child's career, every year in their IEP, that your voice is heard loudly and clearly. And this is the first part where you will be contributing to the data. Let's go to the next slide. Excellent. So I don't know why this is the law, but it is. You'll see that there's going to be space to record your child's hearing and vision screening. Now, this is an older form, so the only change that's been made is under vision, that the team needs to know your child's near and far vision, how they passed in a screening. Now, as you know, we don't have as many school nurses as we did in the olden days. And for that reason, typically a school district will hire nurses to come in and do a certain set of students for vision and hearing every year. Your child's vision and hearing may not be screened in the year that you're having their IEP. So in that case, what would be great for the rest of the IEP team would be if you could ask from your child's pediatrician to have a copy of the vision and hearing screening that they do at your child's annual physical. That way we can have more up-to-date information. I get it. The law says that you don't need to do that more than every 3 years, but what if your child has a vision issue that has gone undiscovered or untreated? That's going to change everything. So if you can provide that information from your child's annual physical, that would be awesome. All right. Now, I had mentioned that you are going to be seeing a lot of data from the team, and this is actually where they're going to start to provide that to you on a more detailed basis. So right now we're going to look at the pre-academic, academic, and functional skills, but really in these sections, it doesn't matter if you're doing this section or the communication or the behavior. In all of them, you should be seeing 3 different types of data. Number one, you should see that the team has put together all of the data and they're looking for trends. What I mean by that is that previously what used to happen is that our teachers would they would send out not only parent input forms, but teacher input forms as well. And then you would see bullet points. The math teacher says this, the social studies teacher says this, the English language arts teacher says this. No, that's not what we want to see. What we want is for the case manager to look for trends. It may be that your child completes all of their classwork and all of their homework except in math, because that's where they're struggling, or except in English language arts, because that's where they're struggling. It may be that your child is frequently absent, or that there's something else that that the team finds to be really significant in measuring their progress. That all needs to be put out there for you so that you can see exactly what data it is that they're looking at. After they give you that data and those trends, they should be talking about the classroom implications of that data. So if we go back to the example of the student who is completing all of their in-class work and all of their homework, except in math, where they're only getting 50% of their classwork done and 20% of their homework, then the next section there should explain what the implications of that would be. If a student is not following along in math and getting all their in-class work and their practice done at home for homework, they're going to have difficulty following classroom discussions. They're going to have difficulty building upon their knowledge step by step. And so you'll see that in that second paragraph that talks about, oh, because we're seeing this with your child, this is what's happening in the classroom. And then each one of those sections should have a summary paragraph. And in that summary paragraph, what's happening is that the case manager or the service provider is explaining more globally who your child is as a learner. So for this part, they might talk about not only what's happening in the classroom, but what they've observed in the playground, what they've observed in the lunchroom. If your child is in high school, it might be that this is what they have observed in their transition services that they're getting. So that's the paragraph that ties everything together for you. So in checking this, when it comes home a couple of days before the IEP, if you think there isn't enough information there, that's the time to send the case manager an email and ask for the data that you want to see. They're going to try and get as much in there as they possibly can, but sometimes they're not aware of the fact that there's something really important to you that they haven't hit. So make sure that you have that email with your case manager so that you do get all of the data that you need. Next slide. Thank you. So, so this is sort of a test, this last part. The way that this is written is that we're following a chain of data and a chain of decisions that are being made. So really, at any time, anyone with a special education background should be able to read your child's psychoeducational report, the report you got when your child was tested. They should be able to read that and the present levels. And even without knowing your child, they should be able to identify what it is that your child needs in terms of goals. So this is a section where there will be a listing of your child's needs. And when you're dealing with an IEP, whether you're a parent or a speech pathologist or anyone who's on the team, you should know that needs drive goals and goals drive services. So when you see that there's a need here that's been identified, you know that's your cue to look at the goals. So again, you get a copy of the draft of your child's IEP. You can read through the present levels, go down to the bottom and make sure that all of the needs that you see there are in agreement with what you think your child's needs are. And then you can compare it to the goals that they gave you. It's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence. In other words, when I work in the schools as a speech pathologist, I don't write separate goals for language processing. What I do is I wait until the case manager has written the academic goals, and then I infuse what I'm doing with the student into their academic goals, because I want everybody working on language all the time. So it may not be a one-to-one, but you should be able to see that the goals that were presented to you to talk about in the IEP meeting match this list of needs. All right, let's go on to the next slide. And in our next slide, we're going to talk about our next form, which is special factors. And what that means is we're going to take a look at some things that are special considerations for your child. And there are going to be 3 of them. The first one of these is assisted technology. Now, for those of you whose children are attending schools in San Mateo County, I'm about to say something that may be different from other SELPAs. The CDE, the California Department of Education, feels that these questions about assisted technology have only to do with students who have specialized equipment. These are students with orthopedic impairments, hearing impairments, or vision impairments. Students who have those disabilities are considered to have disabilities that are low incidence. They don't happen all that often, but because they are very specialized, these students can use sometimes additional equipment and additional services. That's what the CDE thinks this first question is all about. In our SELPA, we know that our students move very, very frequently. There's just a lot of movement between our county, San Francisco, and Santa Clara counties. And that all has to do with housing. And so we know that our kids move a lot. So in our SELPA, we understand that yes, this section is for students who need Braille, who need walkers, who need standards. We totally get that part. But we also think that anything that a student is given to make their learning boosted up, to make it more powerful, things like graphic organizers, things like checklists, things like pencil grips. We recommend that our case managers include that here too, because we know that our kids move around a lot. And so there will be several places where that information will be added to the IEP, only because we know that if our students move out of our county, we want to be very clear about what helps their learning. And so for that reason, you may see things in there that you wouldn't find on other IEPs. But we feel it's really important. The rest of the questions have to do with students that have visual, hearing, or orthopedic impairments. And so if your child has a disability that fits in those categories, then you should see that this is all filled out. For most of our students, it won't be, except for maybe that top, if there are certain things, certain tools that they use in the classroom every day. Let's go to the next slide. And in this next slide, now we're going to talk about the middle of the page for special factors. And what this is addressing here will be if your student is learning English. So if your student is learning English, the IEP team needs to decide that what they're going to do about instruction, because some children need to have some additional instruction in their home language. Other students, not so much, but that's an IEP team decision. And so when you are listening to this part of the IEP, you want to make sure that you can share with the team what you've seen about the way your child is learning English. If you feel your child needs to have some extra support in the language that they use at home, this is the time to talk about it in the IEP meeting. This will probably be filled out before you get there, but that doesn't mean that we aren't looking for input from you. The rest of the IEP team wants to make sure that they have the information accurately and that they've taken your input into consideration. So they're going to have a discussion about having some support in your child's home language. They are going to identify which language or languages are going to be used when your child is being taught. If your child is going to be getting some extra help in learning English, then they're going to identify who's going to do that. And they're going to also identify what kind of a classroom setting that extra help with English is going to happen in. So this is a good time to share any concerns that you have about your child learning English. Now, there's a bunch of boxes there about how, what settings a student could learn their English language development in. And they do mean something a little bit different in each district. So I haven't defined those here, but you can certainly ask what those things mean, like English language mainstream immersion. What does that mean for your district? And again, that can mean something different in any of our 33 different districts. Next slide. This is the final or the bottom part of the IEP, and this is a great place for parent input. Now, before getting into the IEP, your case manager is going to have filled this out again, and that's great. But they only have information about what happens with your child at school, right? So if you happen to know something that is very powerful in maintaining on task and good learning behavior that you use at home, for instance, when you're doing homework, awesome. Please make sure the rest of the IEP team knows what that is, because if it's possible to integrate it into the classroom, case managers and other teachers are going to be really happy to do that. So the first question is whether or not your child's behavior gets in the way of their learning, or the student sitting next to them, if it gets in their way of learning too. If the answer is yes, then what that means is there should be a very clear statement about what it is that your child is struggling with. I was talking with a mom today about her daughter who runs out of the classroom frequently. Well, why does she do that? She does that because she gets very, very overwhelmed. And so it's really important that the IEP team concentrates on what to do about that. And so for her, the answer to that question would be yes, she runs out of the classroom when she's feeling overwhelmed. But we don't want to just concentrate on your child's behavioral challenges. And here's where you can be really, really helpful. All teachers make something like 300 decisions a day. Part of those decisions includes what they do to help every child in their class attend and be a good student, if you will, every single day throughout every single period. And so teachers have different things that they do in their classroom for all students. On top of that, they've learned from being with your child what your child responds to. But if you have other tricks up your sleeve on how it is that you make sure that your child's learning can be, or their behavior doesn't interfere with their learning, this would be a great time to let the team know. You could even say something along the line, I've had kids who collect superhero figures or Pikachu cards or any of those things. And sometimes it really helps if you and the classroom work together and set up a behavior plan where you can provide some of those rewards when a child gets home too. So it's really important that you hear what it is that the teachers are doing for your child, but it's just as important that you talk to the teachers about what you're doing at home to make sure that your child's behavior is as strong as it can be. If your child is having some behavior challenges, then you should see either a behavior goal on your child's IEP or something called a BIP, a behavior intervention plan. A behavior intervention plan is what comes after behavior goals on an IEP. Sometimes all it takes is just a goal on an IEP for a year for a student's behavior to get to the point where it's not interfering with their learning or anyone else's. But sometimes there needs to be a more organized and systematic approach to handling a child's behavior. And in that case, you would have a behavior intervention plan. It's important, if your child has a behavior intervention plan, that be reviewed every single year, because a student with a behavior plan we should see some growth there in their behavior. And so what worked one year may not be necessary the next year, or maybe something worked for part of the year, but not all of the year. No matter the circumstances, that plan needs to be reviewed every year so that anything that your child needs in that year, every year is different, every teacher is different, and the curriculum is different. So that behavior plan needs to take that into account. And the next slide, please. So I had mentioned that once you take a look at the present levels, well, first of all, your child's report from all of the assessment, and then the present levels with all of that data and the needs. That's how we look at developing goals. And I just want to point out that this needs to happen every year, that every year people should be going back to that assessment report. The assessment report defines the disability. It doesn't say anything about your child's classroom performance. It's only the disability, but it tells us what areas the IEP team needs to be focused on. When we're looking at goals, the other team members, the school part of the team, is looking at what will be the most effective way to spend their time to increase your child's learning abilities. So sometimes you hear the expression, what's going to give us the biggest bang for our buck? And so that's what the goals are going to be written to. Ideally, a child's IEP should have 3 to 5 goals on it. That doesn't sound like a lot of goals. It may be more if you have a lot of service providers. But the thing is, if you have too many goals, it's going to be hard for people to keep track on what the focus area is for your child. And everyone's going to be spending all their time taking data, and that takes away time from teaching. So again, the IEP team, including you, needs to make the decision on what are the most important things that we need to focus on for this year. So sometimes we hear, I want my child to have a goal for shoe tying. I want my child to have a goal for eating, being able to feed themselves, all those kinds of things. The other factor is that the goals need to be tied to the curriculum. So just because there isn't a goal written for shoe tying doesn't mean that people aren't going to be working on it. When I was a special day class teacher, if I had students, and I taught 3rd through 5th, if I had students who couldn't tie their shoes, we didn't write a goal for that. Instead, what I would do is I would say, absolutely, we're going to work on that. What I need is for you to send me a set of recess shoes. So every time our kids went out for recess, I would, for my kids who were working on tying their shoes, I would make sure that they took their school shoes off, put on their recess shoes, which meant they had to tie their shoes, right? They had to practice tying their shoes. And then when they came back from recess, they would have to do the same, take off their recess shoes and then put on their school shoes. So between the 2 recesses and lunch, my kids practiced tying their shoes 6 times a day, taking those shoes on and off and changing shoes. We didn't need a goal for that. We just needed to practice until our students learned that, oh, that's how I tie my shoes. Okay, that's fine. So the things that are important to you need to be on a list. You should go into the IEP meeting with a list if you don't see them in the proposed goals, and then talk to the rest of the team to see if, number 1, there needs to be a goal to address your concern. And if not, what are the activities that your child is going to be involved in order to learn the skill that you've identified as something that they need to work on. So in looking at the goal form, over on the left-hand side, up on the top, where the area of need is, this is where you go back to that last question that was on present levels, where it asks for the case manager to identify your child's needs. That area of need should be reflected there. So if they say reading comprehension, then there has to be a goal for reading comprehension. Now, in the baseline, it could be that there's going to be a brand new goal for your child, one that's never happened before. In that case, it's going to be kind of hard to come up with a baseline. So what they're going to do, whoever the service provider is they're going to describe what it is your child can do that tells them that this goal is the most logical next step. So again, as a speech pathologist, I may be thinking that for one of my students that what they need is the picture exchange communication system. So for my students with intellectual disabilities who aren't, or autism who weren't verbal, this is how I would make sure that they learn language. So they would give an adult an icon that would represent something they were thinking or feeling or needing at the time. That's not something you just jump into. That takes a couple of years to develop the skills in order to use that system. And so what I might do is I might describe how I know now my children are ready for the picture exchange communication system. Typically, what that meant was I would go in at snack time, put down some icons or some little simple drawings that represented 3 or 4 choices that they could have for snack. And then my students would point to the one that they really wanted, because there's nothing more motivating than food, right? So we would always start with that. And once I knew that my children could do that, awesome, we're ready to do PECs, we're ready to do picture exchange communication. But if you don't see anything written in that baseline, I need you to promise me you're going to stop the IEP meeting and say, I need to know where my child is right now, because that's what a baseline is all about. It tells you that as of the day of the IEP, this is where your child is in terms of that goal. So if the goal is written for reading comprehension and they want your child to be able to answer independently reading comprehension questions, then you need to know where they are now. If you're aiming for 90%, where are they starting now? Make sure there's a baseline there. Quite frankly, that's not something that we're all very good at. So you may need to ask the IEP team to fill that in. They're fine with the rest of the form, but that particular place, I don't know, for some reason it's an issue. Now, the way that your goals should be written hasn't changed since 1975. And I think that you will find, if you look at your children's goals, that for the most part, they do follow this format. They do follow the formula. So there should be a date. It should be, when is it that this goal is going to be met? And that's usually a year out. When given, and so what you'll see is by September 2023, when given, sometimes what our teachers will do is they'll be thinking, and they'll put an academic task there, but that's not really what goes there. And what you need to have are true instructional conditions. So those instructional conditions would be, let's say you have a child who's in the 5th grade, but they're reading at a 2nd grade level. That doesn't mean that we're going to be putting your child into a 2nd grade reading group. It doesn't work that way. By law, your child's IEP goals have to be written to the grade that they're currently in. So when given a 5th grade reading passage, that's not an instructional condition. But if your case manager says, when given pre-teaching, comma, a personal dictionary, comma, graphic organizers, all the things they're going to use to teach your child to read that 5th grade passage, that's what goes in there. And it's important for you to have that, because when your child brings home their homework, if they come home without a graphic organizer, if they come home without their personal dictionary, how are you supposed to help them with their homework? Your homework time should go just as smoothly as the teaching time in school. But if you don't have the same tools the teacher has, that's not going to happen. So it's very important that both you and your child understand what those instructional conditions are, because your child needs to bring those things home to do their homework. So if everything on the goal page, to me, for parents, that's the most important thing. What is it that they're being given in the classroom that they should also bring home for their homework? And then you should see your child's name, what it is that they're supposed to produce, with how much accuracy or consistency, how many times a week, or how many assignments, all of that is in there. That's important because you have to know how progress is being measured. If you don't know how progress is being measured, then the last thing we want is for you to get to the next annual and hear that your child didn't meet a goal and you don't know why. So you want to make sure that you know exactly what the target is and how your child is doing with that. And I'm going to show you where you'll see that in just a minute. So this box, right, there's a series of boxes as to who's supposed to, what these goals are answering, right? So the first one is, if anytime your child has a math or an English language arts or some other academic goal, you should see a standard number there, the core curricular state standard that your child is working on. Now, when you go and look that up, you may say, hey, wait, this goal doesn't exactly match the core curricular state standard, but that's okay. Because what happens is that your service providers will look at that and say, what's the most important thing for your child to learn this year? And that's the part of the curriculum that they're going to be concentrating on. So it's perfectly within your rights to ask about what core curricular state standard is being addressed so that you can look it up and you can see why it is that they picked just this one little piece of it for your child to work on. Everyone else is going to be looking at the other boxes. So if you have a speech pathologist, an occupational or physical therapist, or a mental health specialist, they are going to be clicking that box, addresses other educational needs because of your child's disability. So you won't get a state standard for that. If your child is learning English, these goals need to be written with what we call linguistic appropriateness. So that means that if your child is learning English, that's taken into consideration in this goal, and those instructional conditions are going to include things like vocabulary so that your child can follow along with the rest of the fifth graders if that's where they are. If your child is in high school, then they will have an additional piece to their IEP called an individualized transition plan. Now, again, in San Mateo County, we do things a little bit differently. And it is the policy in this county that all of our ninth graders get their first ITP. The reason for that is it's really not required until a child turns 16. But we want to make sure in San Mateo County that the voice of the parent and the student is, again, heard loudly and clearly. And the ITP, the individual transition plan, addresses what happens after high school. And so if we don't start planning for that during the freshman year, a student can be off track by the time that they, through no fault of their own, they can be off track and for what it is that they want to do. So that's why you'll see down at the bottom here, that last set is transition goals, because every ninth grader is going to get a plan that addresses education and training after they leave high school, employment after they leave high school, and their independent living skills. So you may see that there. And then underneath that is the person responsible. This is both the special education and general education staff who are responsible for reporting on your child's progress and implementing all those instructional conditions that are in the goal. Let's go to the next slide. For our students who are moderately to severely impacted by their disability, by law, they need to have short-term objectives too. They're not required for students with mild to moderate disabilities, but they are certainly helpful because they break down for you what's going to be going on throughout the year. They are not required by law, so often you won't see them. But know that even in that case, your case managers and your service providers are tracking your child's progress throughout the year. Because if they see that a student isn't making the progress they expected they would, then they're going to call for another IEP. They're going to call for another IEP so that you can look at this goal, decide if the goal is still appropriate, if something needs to be changed, or if services need to be added. So those short-term objectives, even if they're not on the paper, really are being tracked by your case manager and other service providers. Let's go to the next slide. Now, I mentioned progress reporting, and progress reporting is something that happens throughout the year. Usually, when your child receives their report cards, you should also be getting a report on every one of your child's goals. So on the goals page, there's a place for progress reporting. And usually there's 2 or 3, depending on how often your district sends home report cards. So this is where objectively, not I kind of think, or it seems like, but they should be giving you data on your child's progress on this goal. So if they started off being able to do something at 50% and we're aiming for 90%, by the time you get that first progress report, they should be above 50%. That was their baseline. So that's where baseline measurement comes in too, right? If you don't know where they started, how do you know where they're going? So there should be an indication on that progress report about where your child is in terms of meeting that goal. And then there's going to be a comment. So if there's any kind of, if there's anything like your child being absent a great deal because they've been sick, or if there's something about their behavior, or if there was something that happened at home, like a divorce that might cause stress for a child, and so they're not really able to concentrate as much in class, those are all going to be recorded there too, because if there's something there that needs to be addressed, this will be a great time to be able to do it. And then the final progress report will be that annual review. So at the annual IEP that you have, there's going to be a decision made as to whether or not your child met their goal. So if a goal is going to be continued, then you have to be given a rationale for that. Why do they want to continue that goal for the next year? And if they want to do that, and it should be for a reason linked to the curriculum, and if they want to do that, that's fine, they can, but those instructional conditions have to be changed. Because if you keep on doing what you keep on doing, you're going to keep on getting what you keep on getting. So if a student doesn't meet a goal, it may be that they came close to it, but not quite, and the team decides that, yeah, they still need some more practice with this, then those instructional conditions have to change. We're not going to teach them the same way. This time we're going to do something a little bit different. If a goal is not going to be continued when it's not met, that's fine too, but you should hear the rationale why. Why is it that we're not going to continue that goal? And usually, again, it has to do with the curriculum, that it's not going to be relevant for the student's curriculum the next year. Let's go to the next slide, because now what we're going to be seeing after goals is we're going to be talking about services. And there's going to be a discussion before you get to this part. The discussion is going to have to do with what was considered as the least restrictive environment for your student. And I didn't include it on here because for every district, what their continuum of services looks like is a little bit different. So it might be, it might vary from district to district on that. And also there's a second paragraph that's called mitigation of effects. So what that means is that the research shows us that when a student is pulled out of a classroom to get special education services, that's that can be harmful too, because what it means is that everyone else in your child's class is getting instruction that your child is missing. So if that's the case, then the IEP team needs to make a plan. What are they going to do to make sure that your child doesn't fall behind on what's going on in the classroom? So again, that varies from district to district, and it's highly specific for each student. So it's not included in here, but it is something that you will have discussed in your child's IEP. Okay, so then the next section that's going to happen are supplementary aids and services or other supports. And what that means is these are things that aren't delivered directly to your child usually, but it is for other members of the IEP team. So you and everyone else might need training on a behavior plan. You and everyone else might need training on how to use an augmentative or alternative communication device. All of those things that are sort of the background information to your child's program might be something that you get some training on and everyone else on the IEP team does as well. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm sort of working upwards here. So we've talked about supports and supports to staff and supports to your child. But then also there can be program modifications. And a program modification is something that is happening in the classroom. That's important because when your child is being assessed in statewide assessments, these modifications need to happen in that assessment too. And by the way, your child has the federally protected right to be assessed every year along with everyone else. And so that form may look a little bit different, but that's your heads up as to your child's progress. You want to see where they are in comparison to their same age peers. So it's another test as to how well the IEP is working. I know it's very tempting sometimes to ask that your child not take that statewide assessments, but I would be really careful about doing that because it's another touchstone on how effective your child's IEP is. So if there are program modifications, then there should be those same modifications on the assessment. And a modification is a change in that curricular standard that we were talking about. That changes it so much that your child's the curriculum is being changed so much that now we're not talking about the usual core curricular state standard. So if your child needs to have a modification, awesome, that's good. Let's make sure that it happens, but know that that's a signal to you that your child is not getting the same curriculum that everyone else is getting. It's changed a little bit because of their disability. And then let's go to the next slide. This is far more common. Now we're talking about accommodations. And these accommodations are it's kind of interesting because if you line up 100 lawyers, 50 of those lawyers will say that all IEPs should have accommodations, and the other 50 will say, no, they don't need to have them. But the accommodations, the reason that we think that there's those first 50 that say that, yes, your child should have accommodations, remember that the goal of special education is really to get our students back into the mainstream as much as possible. And so theoretically, if you have a legally defensible IEP, what that means is, and your child is mildly to moderately impacted by their disability, what that means is that eventually, because every year we should see a reduction in their services, in the frequency, the intensity, or the duration of their services. So, and when we get to services, we'll talk about this more in depth, but usually what happens is services are replaced by accommodations. And the reason for that is once students leave us in the public school system, IEPs don't follow them. Once they get their certificate of completion or their diploma, when our students go off to college, when our students go off to vocational training, they don't get IEPs anymore. They don't get special education support. But what they do get is they do get accommodations. And so that's why we should see more accommodations, growth in there as services are declining. Services, as they get reduced, that's an excellent sign to you that things are working and that your child has an IEP that's doing what it's supposed to, which is increasing the time your child spends in general education and decreasing the time that they're spending in special education. So let's see, let's go on to our next slide. Because now we're going to start talking about services. And there are two things that I want to talk about that should be a discussion every single year. One of these is special education transportation, and the other one is ESY, or extended school year. So special education transportation, that's actually considered to be a related service. So there's an assessment for that. If you are asking for special education transportation for the first time, then the IEP team is going to discuss 5 questions. 5 questions that lead to whether or not your child qualifies for special education transportation. Knowing that you have to leave for work at 7:30 in the morning and your child doesn't get picked up until 8 o'clock isn't a reason, unfortunately, for special education transportation. It has to do with safety, and it has to do with access to getting to school. So if you're asking for special education transportation for the first time, you'll hear those 5 different questions. If your child has had special education transportation in the past, the assumption is that they're going to be offered that again, unless your child has made so much progress on special education transportation that now they can take general education transportation. So just like classes, it's going to be, the IEP team is going to be working to get your child on the big bus instead of the little bus, because that is less restrictive. That is more typical of what their peers are doing. If your child is in a program that is not offered at their neighborhood school, then you have the federally protected right to special education transportation. That's the only time that special education transportation is automatic. So this should be something that you discuss with the rest of the IEP team during the meeting. The same is true of ESY, or extended school year. There's a difference between ESY, that's special education, and summer school, that's general education. For our students with mild to moderate impacts on their learning from their disabilities, they usually go to summer school. For students who are more moderately to severely impacted by their disability, they usually go to extended school year. And most people think of extended school year as all the services that they get throughout the school year, they should also get during those 20 days in June and July. But I would caution you to ask the team, if they don't do this automatically, to talk about each and every one of your child's services in ESY. Here's the reason why. As an SLP, as a speech and language pathologist, what I really want is for my students to be in the most language-rich environment they can possibly have if language is part of their disability. I know that when the classrooms run during these summer sessions, they are very different from what happens during the school year. They're very hands-on. They're very project-based. They're very experiential, if you will. They're not paper pencil tasks. They're usually lots and lots of activities. That means there's a lot of language going on. So as an SLP, I may recommend to the rest of the team, including you, that you don't have speech and language services, because there's going to be so much language in the classroom that I don't want my student to miss out on that. And that's true for every single one of the services. Help your team remember that every single service needs to be evaluated as to whether or not it needs to happen on a pull-out basis, or if your child should be in the classroom. All right, there is another slide. I want to see if you can see that. What do you have for the next slide? Okay, good. We have reached the question and answer part of our time here tonight. It is 7 o'clock. So at this point, let's see, there's something in the chat here. Oh, okay. At this point, if you have any questions, if you'd like to put them in the chat, I'm going to do my best to answer them for you.
Definitely learn from each other. Thank you for your questions. Now we're going to move. Just a reminder for everyone, Iris, if you can please put again our phone number and email in the chat for the participants. We have a QR code previously here. You can see the QR code for, opening our Facebook account or our website. We will be sending a copy of this presentation tomorrow by email, along with the handouts, and also another link if you didn't have the opportunity to complete our survey. Karen, thank you so much for being here tonight and giving us this excellent presentation. We're looking forward to have you maybe in the future. And then, thank you all families for being here, providers, thank you. I definitely think there's always more room for questions, and we're always excited to invite people who can help us to learn more, and we can also share that information with our families and providers. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate any chance I get to talk with parents.
All right, thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.